The nursery was burning, and the Alpha King's heir, the most protected child in all 7-pack territories, was still inside. Every royal guard was screaming at the door. Every instinct said, "Get the cub out." But the boy wouldn't move. He was 4 years old, crouched on the scorched floor, clinging to the hem of a charred cloak with both fists. And he was screaming back at the guards with the full, furious voice of a child who had already decided. Not without her. Not without her. Beneath him, barely breathing, lay Senna, an Omega nursemaid with no title, no bloodline, no standing in the pack court. The woman who had thrown her body over the Alpha King's son when the fire came. The woman the court had spent 2 years trying to remove. The woman no one had ever thought mattered. She was the reason the heir was alive. And when Alpha King Daran Ashvale arrived at the burning corridor and saw his son on the floor, saw the scorched cloak, the small fists, the child's face streaked with ash and tears and pure defiance, something broke open in him that he had spent 2 years keeping sealed. Because he recognized what his son was doing, he was refusing to leave someone behind. The same way Daran had failed to do 2 years ago. For Senna herself. Act 1, the Omega no one chose. Let me tell you about Senna first, because the court never did. She was 24 years old when she came to Ashvale Stronghold, the great walled seat of the most powerful Alpha bloodline in the known Packlands. She came not through the ceremonial gates with their iron wolf heads and their banners of silver on black. She came through the servants' entrance. Yes, in the early morning, before most of the household was awake. Omega. No family name worth recording. The daughter of a wandering pack healer who had died the previous winter, leaving her nothing but his knowledge of medicines and the kind of quiet, unshakable steadiness that comes from spending a childhood watching people suffer and choosing every single day to help anyway. She had been hired as an under-nursemaid, the lowest position in the royal nursery, below the head nurse, below the 2 senior attendants, below even the laundry staff who served the nursery floor. Her job was to be present when others were not. Night watches, the difficult hours, the times when the child cried and no one else wanted to get up. The child in question was Kale, 4 years old at the time of the fire, but 2 when Senna arrived. The Alpha King's only heir. Dark-haired, gray-eyed, serious in the way of children who have learned early that the world does not always feel safe. Kale's mother, Alpha Queen Vessa, had died in childbirth, something the court spoke of in hushed tones, and the Alpha King did not speak of at all. King Daran Ashvale was 34, tall, iron-shouldered with the deep gray eyes that ran in his bloodline, and a jaw that looked as if it had been carved specifically to hold difficult things without showing the effort. He ruled with exactness and control, and the particular coldness of a man who had learned that feeling things too openly in a pack court was an invitation to be destroyed. He had loved his bonded mate. He did not recover from losing her the way the court expected him to. Cleanly, officially, and with a prescribed period of mourning, and then a return to function. He recovered the way real grief works, which is to say imperfectly and slowly, and with long months where he looked at his son and saw Vessa's face, and didn't know whether that was gift or punishment. Kale was largely raised by the nursery staff, and largely, in the quiet hours, by Senna. She did not try to make herself significant. That was the first thing that set her apart from every other person in the Ashvale court, where significance was pursued with the intensity of a blood sport. She showed up. She did her work. When Kale woke screaming from night terrors, which happened often in his 2nd year, when the strange, formless fears of toddlerhood combined with something that Senna recognized as grief in the body, it's the kind young children carry for losses they can't name. She was there. Every time. Without fail. Without complaint. She learned his particular language before he had full words. The way he pulled at his left ear when he was overstimulated. The specific quality of silence that meant he was frightened rather than simply tired. The foods he would eat when he was upset, and the ones that made it worse. She told him stories. Not the grand pack legend kind with battle and glory that the senior attendants favored, simpler ones. about animals and seasons and small acts of courage that didn't require an audience. He listened to those with his whole body, the way children listen to things they recognize as true. By the time Cale was 3, he would not go to sleep without Senna in the room. The head nurse, Marette, he noticed this with the focused disapproval of a woman who considered the nursery her sovereign territory. "The boy is becoming dependent," she said at the first of what would become many conversations with the senior household staff about the problem of the under-nursemaid. An Omega with no bloodline, no standing. He calls for her before he calls for anyone else. It isn't appropriate. No one disagreed. No one in the Ashvale court had any particular reason to defend Senna. She had no allies, no connections, nothing to offer anyone in the invisible economy of court favor. She was, in every measurable sense, no one. And no one thought to ask Cale what he thought. The attempts to remove her began quietly. A reassignment, first. Senna was transferred to general household duties, away from the nursery entirely. Good Cale cried for 3 days with an intensity that alarmed the court physician. Senna was quietly returned, with no explanation given to anyone. Then there was the matter of the council complaint, a formally lodged grievance from Lord Brennan's faction, claiming that an unbonded Omega of unknown lineage in close daily contact with the Alpha heir presented a social propriety concern. The complaint was reviewed. It went nowhere, because the boy was 4 and the logic was absurd, but it left a mark. It told Senna clearly that there were people in this stronghold who wanted her gone. She understood this. She was not naive. She stayed anyway, because Cale needed her, and she was not the kind of person who left when staying was difficult. She had, in 2 years, also done something she had never intended, and would not have chosen if she'd been given the option to choose. She had begun to see the Alpha King. Not as a title, as a person. She saw him in the moments he didn't know he was being observed, standing at the nursery doorway in the evenings, watching his son sleep, with an expression that he never wore in the corridors of power. Something exposed. Something that held both love and grief in the same breath without being able to separate them. She saw him when he sat with Cale on the rare mornings he allowed himself that time, the way he held the boy with a careful, almost frightened tenderness, as if he was still not certain he deserved this particular thing. She said nothing about any of it. It was not her place, but she saw him. And once, only once, he had seen her seeing him. Auntie had come to the nursery doorway earlier than usual. Cale was still awake, sitting in Senna's lap while she told him one of her small stories, her voice low and unhurried. Darren had stood in the doorway for a moment longer than he should have. Senna had looked up. Their eyes met. She did not look away with the quick, submissive drop of gaze that Omegas in the court had learned to perform around the Alpha King. She simply held his look with the same calm steadiness she brought to everything, a gaze that did not challenge and did not defer, that simply said, "I see you. You're not invisible to me either." He had looked away first. He did not return to the nursery doorway in the evenings for 2 weeks after that. Act 2. The Night of the Fire. The fire started in the lower storage corridor at the 3rd hour after midnight. Later, so when the investigation was complete, the finding would confirm what Senna had already understood from the moment she smelled the smoke. It was not an accident. Oiled rags, a deliberate placement below a ventilation shaft that fed directly toward the nursery wing. Someone had known exactly how fire moves through stone corridors, had known the nursery would fill with smoke before the flames arrived, had known the night watch rotation and the precise window of vulnerability it created. Someone had wanted the Alpha King's heir dead. The same faction that had filed the council complaint. The same lord whose ambitions would be considerably advanced by the removal of the current bloodline's only heir. But that was later. In the moment, in the 3rd hour after midnight, as when the first tendril of smoke reached Senna through the gap under the nursery door, there was no time for understanding. There was only the smoke and the child asleep in the room behind her, and the decision that Senna made so fast it barely registered as a decision at all. She was out of her cot and through the inner door before she was fully awake. Cale was already coughing. Small, confused sounds, his eyes not yet open. Senna crossed the room in 4 steps, pulled him from the bed, wrapped him in the heaviest blanket she could reach, and pressed his face against her shoulder. "Don't breathe deep," she said, low and steady. "Small breaths. With me, small breaths." She moved toward the door to the outer corridor. The handle burned her palm. She pulled back, recalibrated. The outer corridor was already compromised. She could hear it now, the deep, structural roar of something large burning, not the crack and spit of small flame, but the voice of a fire that had already decided it owned this space. The nursery window. Second floor. A drop she had mentally measured 100 times in the way that people who are responsible for small children in old buildings tend to do, without fully admitting to themselves why. 12 feet to the kitchen garden roof below. Survivable, if the landing was managed. She wrapped Cale tighter. Then the roof beam above the outer door cracked, a sound like a giant's knuckle breaking, and a section of the ceiling came down in a wash of burning debris directly across the room, between Senna and the window. She turned her body before she thought about it, pulled Cale against her chest, curled over him, took the falling debris across her back and shoulders, with a sound she would not let herself make because the child could not hear her make it. The cloak caught. She patted it out with one hand, while holding Cale with the other, moving, always moving, because stopping was dying, and she was not going to let this child die. The wall to her left, the shared wall with the adjoining reading room, had a crack in the plaster she had noticed 6 months ago and had put in a maintenance report about, and no one had ever fixed. She drove her shoulder into it. Once. Twice. The plaster gave. The reading room beyond was clear. No fire. She could breathe. She moved through, coughing hard now, her back a map of pain she was not yet allowing herself to process. Cecile pressed against her chest, making small sounds against her shoulder that were afraid but also trusting. That specific combination that meant he was scared, but he believed she had him. She made it to the far door, down the servants' stair, out into the inner courtyard. And there she stopped, because her legs stopped working. She made it to the courtyard stone, turned to set Cale down gently on the flagstones, made sure he was clear, saw his eyes, awake and frightened and present. And then sat down, rather suddenly. "Stay with me," Cale said, very clearly. "Senna, stay." "I'm here," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." She meant it. She was not entirely sure how true it was going to be. Act 3. The boy who would not leave the Royal Guards found them 4 minutes later. Or rather, they found where the fire had started. Sue followed the path of nursery staff running in the wrong direction, and eventually found the courtyard, where a 4-year-old heir to the Ashvale pack was sitting on the flagstones, beside an unconscious Omega with a charred cloak and burns across her upper back. Cale was not unconscious. Cale was extremely, precisely 4-year-oldly awake. The head guard, Captain Theron, a veteran of 6 border campaigns who had faced armed challengers and pack rebellions, and a particularly memorable incident with a rival Alpha's werewolves, would later say that the child had been the most immovable thing he had encountered in 30 years of service. "The heir needs to come with us, young master. Right now. We need to get you inside." "No." "Sir, the fire. I'm not leaving Senna. We'll come back for—" "No." What followed was not a tantrum. Theron would be clear about this in every retelling. It was not hysteria or confusion. The boy was perfectly coherent. He was simply absolutely certain, in the way that very young children are sometimes more certain than any adult, that the thing he was saying was right, and that no force in the world was sufficient justification for changing it. He had both fists in the hem of Senna's charred cloak. He was not letting go. "She didn't leave me," Cale said, looking up at Captain Theron with gray eyes that were his father's eyes, that already held something his father had spent years trying to hollow out of himself. "So, I'm not leaving her." Theron tried reasoning, tried authority, tried the specific tone of command that worked on everyone in the Ashvale stronghold. The child looked at him with polite, total, unyielding refusal. "Get the king," Theron finally said to the guard behind him, in the quiet voice of a man who knows he is out of his depth. Darren Ashvale had been awake since the first alarm. He had come down the main corridor at speed, in the controlled, deliberate way of an Alpha King who has trained himself never to run in public, because running is panic, and panic spreads, with his jaw set and his eyes doing that thing they did when he was holding something very tightly on the inside. He turned the corner into the inner courtyard. Stopped. Later, he would not be able to fully describe what that moment was. The sight of his son, unhurt, ash-faced, clear-eyed, stubborn, was the kind of relief that hits the body before the mind processes it, a wave so physical it is almost pain. And then he saw what his son was holding on to. Senna, on the flagstones. And her back, even from here he could see the damage. The cloak burned through in 2 places, the skin beneath. The specific way she was lying that said she had placed herself between something dangerous and something she was protecting. Cale looked up at him. "Papa?" Very serious. "I told them I wasn't leaving. She didn't leave me. So I didn't leave her. That's the right thing." Darren crossed the courtyard in 10 steps and crouched down to his son's level. "Yes," he said quietly. "That's the right thing." He looked at Senna. She had regained partial consciousness. Her eyes were half open, unfocused, the specific look of someone whose body is managing severe pain by rationing attention. She heard his voice. He could tell by the slight change in her breathing, the way it hitched and then deliberately steadied, yet as if she was trying to be less of a problem even now. "She needs the physician," Darren said, to Theron, to everyone, to himself. "Now. Carefully." He reached out, and then stopped. Because there was something in the way Cale still held the hem of that cloak. The way his small hands were locked around it with a grip that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the specific, terrible love of a child who has been genuinely cared for, and knows, in his whole body, what it means. Darren put his hand over his son's. "I've got her," he said softly. "I've got her now. You can let go." Cale looked at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he released the cloak. Darren gathered Senna from the flagstones himself. Carefully. The way you carry something irreplaceable, with the full attention of someone who understands that careless hands cause damage that takes a long time to heal. She made a sound when he lifted her, something she was clearly trying to suppress. "I have you," he said, low, just for her. "You're safe." Her eyes found his face, still half-focused, but present enough. "Cale," she said, "is right here. He's fine. Because of you." A pause. The faintest exhale, relief so deep it was almost collapse. "Good," she said, and let herself stop managing. Act 4, the accounting. The conspiracy was unraveled in the days that followed. Lord Brennan's faction. The arson confirmed. 3 men arrested, and 2 more before the week was out. The Lord himself brought before the Pack Council with evidence that had been building for months. The oiled rags, the paid informants inside the guard rotation, the private correspondence that laid out in his own hand what he had intended and why. Darren dismantled it all with the same systematic exactness he brought to everything. But that was the work of governance. And governance he was good at. There was another accounting he was less practiced in. He came to the physician's ward on the 3rd day. Senna was awake, propped against pillows, her back treated and bandaged, her color better than it had been on the flagstones, though still carrying the specific pallor of someone whose body was doing serious work underneath. She had a book open on her lap that she wasn't reading. She looked up when he came in. Did not perform surprise, did not adjust herself into a more presentable arrangement, just looked at him with those steady brown eyes. He sat in the chair beside the bed, not the standing, surveying position he defaulted to everywhere else in the stronghold. Sat, like a person having a conversation. "How bad?" he said. "Manageable," she said. And then, with something almost like humor in the corner of her mouth, "Everything is manageable." "That's not an answer." "The burns on my back will scar," she said directly. "The physician says the hands will heal cleanly. I'll be full use within a month." "I'm not asking about your use." She paused, looked at him with the specific attention of someone recalibrating. "Then the honest answer is that it hurts considerably, and I'm choosing not to focus on that, because focusing on it doesn't change it." "Your father taught you that?" My father taught me that the body is very loud, she said, and you have to decide whether you're going to listen to it constantly or only when it's saying something worth hearing. Daran was quiet for a moment. I was told about the council complaint, he said. Lord Brennan's faction. The attempt to have you removed from the nursery. I was aware of it. Why didn't you come to me? She looked at him with a calm frankness that was, he had come to understand, simply how she moved through the world. Because I was an under-nursemaid with no standing and no bloodline, she said. And you were the Alpha King. That's not a conversation that exists in the Ashvale court. It exists now, he said. The silence held. You knew it wasn't safe, he said. You understood what the complaint meant, that there were people who wanted you gone. And you stayed. Kale needed me. Yes. He paused. Yes, and? She looked at him. And I wasn't going to leave because it was difficult. That's not who I am. He leaned forward slightly. I need to say something, and I'm going to say it plainly, because I find I don't have the patience for anything else anymore. All right. I failed you, he said. I knew Brennan's faction was moving against the nursery staff. I had intelligence that suggested it for 3 months. I prioritized the political strategy of letting it develop so I could dismantle it completely, rather than acting immediately. I made a calculation. A pause. You were part of what that calculation cost, and my son almost paid the rest. Senna was quiet. That's honest, she said finally. I'm not asking for absolution. I'm telling you what happened because you deserve to know it. What do you want me to do with it? It was exactly the right question. He had expected, he realized now, something more like forgiveness or accusation. Something emotional that he could respond to with comfort or defense. Instead, she had asked the practical question, the useful one, the one that required him to actually know his own answer. I want you to know that I see what was done, he said, and I want to ask you, directly, not through anyone else, to stay. In the nursery. In the stronghold. In whatever capacity you choose. The nursery, if you want it. Something else, if you prefer. With protections, and standing, in a formal position that no council lord can challenge. He paused, and because I would like... This was, she could see, costing him something. The Alpha King, who had managed a burning nursery crisis and a treason investigation without visibly breaking a sweat, was visibly uncertain about the next sentence. She waited. I would like to know you, he said. Not the under-nursemaid. Not the woman who saved my son. You, what you think, what you see. The kind of conversations you had with Kale that made him love you the way he does. Those were mostly about frogs, she said. He blinked. He was going through a significant frog period, she explained. We spent about 3 weeks talking exclusively about frogs, their various qualities, their relative merits. Did they have merits? Considerable ones, according to Kale. Something happened to his face, something he clearly hadn't intended. A softening around the eyes, a fractional shift at the mouth. The way a landscape changes when the sun comes out from behind clouds so gradually you can't point to the moment it happened. He told me, Daran said, that you taught him the right thing. To not leave. I taught him that by accident, she said quietly, by just not leaving. That's usually how the real things are taught. Act 5. What fire leaves behind, she stayed. Not because the king asked her to. Not because she had nowhere else. Because Kale was there, and because the thing that had grown in her quietly over 2 years of seeing Daran Ashvale at the nursery doorway had not diminished in the days since the fire. If anything, it had clarified, the way everything clarifies when it has been through heat. She took the formal position of head nursemaid, with the standing and protections that came with it. She moved into better quarters. She was introduced to the council lords at the next formal assembly, standing in a line with senior household staff, and Lord Brennan's empty chair sat at the far end of the table as a quiet sermon to everyone else present. No one tested her standing again. Daran came to the nursery in the evenings again. This time, he didn't stand in the doorway. He came in, sat, listened while Senna told Kale his stories, which had evolved, post-Frog period, into a comprehensive and internally consistent mythology about a pack of small animals who governed themselves by counsel and had strong opinions about seasonal weather. Darin contributed, once, a suggestion about the Animal Council's trade policy. Kale considered this seriously and told him it was interesting, but that the Badger delegate would probably veto it. After Kale was asleep, they talked. Not about the fire, not about the conspiracy, not about any of the large and dramatic things that had brought them to this point. About small things, about her father, and what it was to grow up watching someone heal people with patience and plants. About the bee skeps her father kept, and the particular quality of late summer honey. About Mira, Darin said her name first, carefully, and then more easily, and then with the specific grace of someone who has learned that speaking a name is not the same as opening a wound. She would have liked you, he said, on an evening in late autumn, the fire low in the nursery hearth, Kale breathing slow and even across the room. Senna looked at him. Tell me why. So he did. He told her about Mira, really told her. Not the sanctified court version, but the actual person. The sharp humor, the insistence on doing her own reading rather than receiving court summaries, the specific way she called him on his worst tendency, which was to manage everything from such a distance that he forgot to feel it. She used to say, Darin said, that I ran the pack very well and myself very badly. She wasn't wrong, Senna said. He looked at her. You've been doing the same thing, she said. Since she died, running everything perfectly, and yourself not at all. He stopped. That's accurate. I know. She looked at him with the warm earth steadiness that had been, he realized, the thing he kept returning for. Not her courage, though she had extraordinary courage. Not her competence, though she was more competent than most people he had ever known. This, the simple fact of being genuinely seen by someone who had no interest in his title, and no fear of his power, and no agenda beyond honesty. I watched you for 2 years from the doorway, she said. The way you held him, like you weren't sure you deserved it. He didn't answer. You deserve it, she said, quietly, without ceremony. The fire settled in the hearth. Kale slept. Outside, the first snow of winter was beginning, pale and silent against the dark. Senna, he said. Yes. I would like... He stopped. Started again. I am going to ask you something that I need you to answer honestly. Not in the way people answer the Alpha King. Have I ever answered you any other way? The corner of his mouth moved. No. That's why I'm asking you. She waited. May I know you? He said. For as long as you'll let me? Not as anything formal yet. Not as a position or an arrangement. Just this. You telling me when I'm wrong. Me learning what it sounds like when someone speaks without performance. Both of us figuring out what comes next at a pace that's honest. Senna looked at him for a long, quiet moment. Yes, she said. On one condition. Name it. You come inside, she said. Stop standing at doorways. Whatever it is you're afraid of letting yourself have, come inside and have it. That's the condition. He held her gaze. The gray eyes, the ones Kale had inherited, the ones that could hold so much without showing it, held something now that was not hidden, not managed, just present. All right, he said. What came next was not immediate. It was not easy. Real things rarely are. It was the gradual, serious, occasionally difficult work of 2 people learning each other past the versions of themselves they had been required to perform for the world. Darin learning to say what was true before it calcified into silence. Senna learning that being cared for was not the same as being owed, and that it was permitted to receive what you had spent a lifetime giving. There were council lords who raised concerns, carefully, in the language of protocol and propriety, because the overt alternative had not gone well for Lord Brennan. Darin addressed those concerns with the specific patience of a man who has already made his decision, and is offering the court the courtesy of an explanation rather than a negotiation. There was a formal bonding in time. Simple, as these things went, Darin had learned from a story that had not yet been written, but that lived in the air around him, that ceremony matters less than sincerity, and that what matters is the consent and what it means. Senna's vows were the same she had already been living for 2 years, without knowing that's what they were. "I'll stay," she said at the altar, "as I am. Not as ornament, not as performance. As someone who will tell you when you're wrong, and mean it when I say I have you." Darin looked at her with the face of a man who has come in from the doorway, finally, and found that the inside is warmer than the cold place he had been standing. "That," he said, "is exactly what I'm asking for." Years later, Cale Ashvale, heir to the Stonecrest territories, future alpha of the Ironmark Pact, a subject of 17 formal portraits, and considerably more interesting in person than any of them suggested, would tell his own children the story. Not the political version, not the official account in the Pack histories, which mentioned a fire in the royal nursery, swiftly contained, no loss of life among the principal household. The real one. "There was a fire," he would say, "and Senna put herself between me and it. And when the guards came, I wouldn't leave because she hadn't left me. And your grandfather, the great Alpha King, the one the histories call unbreakable, came into the courtyard and saw what I was doing and said, 'Yes, that's the right thing.' And then what?" his children would ask. "And then he picked her up," Cale would say, "and he brought her in. And he never stood in the doorway again." Some bonds are made in ceremony, and some are made in fire. In the moment when a person with nothing to gain covers another with their body, and says, without words, "You matter. I have you, I'm not leaving." That is the bond that lasts. That is the bond that blood cannot match, and politics cannot make, and time cannot unmake. The cub knew it before the king did, and the king, when he saw it, recognized it, because he had been waiting in the cold doorway of his own grief for someone to give him a reason to come inside. She already had.